Who was George Washington? The introduction. Who was George Washington? 1783. After 7 long years of fighting, the war was finally over. American soldiers had beaten the mighty British Army. The 13 colonies were independent now. There's a picture of the 13 colonies. If you notice, New York is one of them. Represent. Ships full of British soldiers sailed back to England. From here on in, nobody in America had to obey King George. There was going to be a brand new country with 13 United States. And in 1789, when it came time to elect the first president, who was the number one choice? George Washington, of course. George Washington had been the top general throughout the war. He was not the kind of general who just gave orders and then watched soldiers do the fighting. He was often in the thick of the battle. Yet Washington was never wounded, not once. Besides being brave, he was also smart, loyal, honest, and fair. Everything a leader should be. Would the war have been won without him? Many people didn't think so. It was no surprise that he won the first election for president. But when he learned the news, he was not happy. Oh no, he wasn't happy at all. He loved being back in Virginia, at Mount Vernon, his beautiful home. He was 57 years old and hoped to spend the rest of his life there with his wife, Martha, and her 2 youngest grandchildren. As the very first president, so much would be expected from him. And strange as it may seem to us, George Washington worried that he wasn't up to the job. No, the job of president was not at all his liking. But many people said they would only support the new government if George Washington were president. And more than anything, he wanted the new government to work. So he said yes and started off for New York, where he would take the oath of office. At every stop along the way, there were parties and parades for him, just what George didn't want. Today, politicians may spend years planning to run for president. Millions of dollars are spent on campaigns. Yet the man who is known as the father of our country felt like a criminal going off to his execution. All he wanted to do was stay home and go fox hunting. And there's a picture of the inauguration, which happened in New York, not Washington, D.C. Because at the time, New York was like the capital of the United States, not Washington yet. Chapter 1, A Boy from Virginia. On the night of February 22nd, 1732, Augustine Washington sat at a table by candlelight. A family Bible lay open before him. Gus, as everyone called him, was a tobacco farmer in the colony of Virginia. With a pen made from the quill of a turkey, he wrote down the name of his son, George, who had been born that very morning. George's mother, Mary, was Gus's second wife. His first wife had died, leaving him with 2 teenage sons. One night not long before George was born, a bolt of lightning shot down the chimney of Washington's farmhouse. It killed a woman who was visiting Mary. Mary worried that the lightning was a sign of bad luck. It might mean that there'd be something wrong with her baby. But George was a strong, healthy baby. People said he looked like his mother. He grew into a tall, athletic boy who loved to ride horses through the green countryside. In later years, he was known as the best horseman in Virginia. When George was about 7, the family moved to Ferry Farm. It was across the river from Fredericksburg, Virginia. By this time, George had a younger sister, Betty, and 3 younger brothers, Samuel, John, and Charles. People said George and Betty looked a lot alike. As a grown woman, she would do funny imitations of her famous brother. There isn't any information about how George and his father got along, but we do know he wasn't close to his mother. Mary Washington was a cold, bossy woman. All George's friends were scared of her. Strangely, she never took pride in her eldest son, not even after he became president. His letters to her would begin honored madam instead of dear mother, and he never introduced his wife, Martha, to her. The person he loved best in the world was his kind half-brother, Lawrence. Lawrence was Gus's oldest son. He was 14 years older than George. Lawrence had gone to school in England. He had learned Greek and Latin. He knew how to dress like a gentleman and act like a gentleman. There wasn't enough money to send George off to Washington. Instead, he was taught at home, probably by his father and Lawrence. Here's a picture of an American gentleman's outfit. So you can see there's like the old-fashioned hat and a big like coat and even like these boots that they would wear. So it looks very 1700s, right? Especially with the hat. And famous pictures of George Washington would have him wearing that hat. George was great at math. Anything with numbers came easily to him. But he was a terrible speller. It embarrassed him all his life. When George was only 11, his father died. From time to time, George was invited for long visits to Mount Vernon. This was the home of Lawrence and his new bride, Anne Fairfax. George loved it there. In 1746, George was asked to move in for good, and off he went. He probably was happy, too, to get away from his mother. Here's a little inset that I'm going to read. It says, a famous lie. Many generations of school children learned the story of George Washington chopping down a cherry tree on his family's farm. When his angry father asked who had done such a terrible thing, George confessed right away. I cannot tell a lie, he said. Pa, it was I who chopped it down. The story showed how honest George was, even as a small boy. The story, however, was entirely made up. Soon after Washington's death, a man named Mason Locke Weems wrote a book about the first president. Weems wanted Washington to seem perfect, and so he made up stories such as the one about the cherry tree. It took more than 100 years before the truth came out about the untruthful book. Chapter 2, Mount Vernon. At Mount Vernon, a whole new world opened up for George. Now he mixed with the richest families in Virginia. He went fox hunting and to fancy balls. Shy and a little awkward, George wanted to fit in very badly, so he took dancing lessons. In time, he became an excellent dancer. George took fencing lessons and learned about music. He wore nicer clothes. He also wrote himself a long list of rules about good manners. One of the rules was about not spitting into a fire while meat was being cooked in it. Another rule was to avoid killing fleas and lice in the presence of other people. Lawrence's in-laws, the Fairfaxes, were one of the richest families in Virginia. They owned huge tracts of land. There were not maps yet of the west part of the colony, so people often hired surveyors. A surveyor's job was to measure and mark property boundaries. It was the perfect job for George. He loved the outdoors, was quick at math, and needed to earn money. Besides no maps, there were no roads in western Virginia. It was wilderness, so as a surveyor, George lived a rough life. For weeks on end, he'd wear the same clothes, sleep on the ground along with other hired men, cook over an open fire, and try to steer clear of different Native American groups. George grew to be a broad-shouldered young man with clear blue-gray eyes and reddish-brown hair. He wore it in a ponytail. At 6'2", he was the tallest person in a group. His hands and feet were huge, except for he had bad teeth. He had excellent health. Except for his bad teeth, he had excellent health. Lawrence, unfortunately, had much more serious health problems. He developed a terrible cough. In the hope that warm weather might help his brother, George and Lawrence sailed to the island of Barbados off Venezuela. It was George Washington's first and only trip outside of North America. Sadly, Lawrence's health did not improve, and George came down with smallpox, another deadly disease. George survived. Lawrence, however, died in 1752 with George at his bedside. It was a terrible blow for George. He was only 20 and had lost the person he loved most. George Washington not only loved Lawrence, he respected him. Lawrence had been an officer in the militia. A militia is a group of part-time soldiers who are not part of a regular army. Now Lawrence's post was open. George took his brother's place. Here's another little insert. It says, false teeth. Even as a young man, George had problems with his teeth. They caused him a great deal of pain. By the time he became president, he had only one real tooth left. He had to wear false teeth. There are stories about a set of Washington's teeth being made out of wood, but that isn't true. Most often, ivory from elephants, hippos, and other animals were used. The teeth were set into a metal base with heavy springs. Not only painful to wear, the false teeth made it difficult to eat. They pushed out his lips in an unnatural way that embarrassed Washington. No wonder paintings of George Washington as an older man never showed him smiling. One set of Washington's false teeth is displayed at Mount Vernon. It's one of the most popular exhibits. There's a picture of like a cartoon of the false teeth and how they were connected together by like a chain. So these false teeth in his mouth were connected by a chain. On this page, it's a survey and like a map of where George Washington went when he was surveying the land. So all of this was wilderness. There was no really people around there. It was like trees and everything like that. And then finally, here is a map of Mount Vernon, which was his home. So as you can see, it was a pretty large place. And that is the end of chapter 2.